has it exactly the wrong way around. You see, as I was beginning to say earlier, we didn't have time in the question period. I wouldn't say that atheism was morally inferior. I wouldn't concede that for a second. I don't want to make a claim for its superiority either, but there may be a slight edge here. We don't believe anything that could be called wishful. In other words, we don't particularly welcome the idea of the annihilation either of ourselves as individuals, the party will go on and will have left and we're not coming back, or of the entropic heat death of the universe. We don't like the idea, but there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that that is what's going to happen. And there's very, very little evidence to suggest that I'll see you all again in some theme park. One nice and one nasty experience. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to speak to Mr. Hitchens. Thank you very much. I've noticed that you're wearing the Kurdistan flag again on your lapel. And
we might come to that later, Edger.
The Kurdish, also, really thank you very much for that, for your solidarity to the Kurdish people. My question is that thousands of people dying from earthquakes, to the panel question, thousands of people dying from earthquakes can't be called God's punishment. Why is it that a person being saved from under the rubble days later is almost invariably called a miracle? And also, why should God be credited for a good act of a human being, saving a fellow human being from under the rubble, while God being spared for the calamity that was brought upon the people?
Yes. Look, I promise you I did not have anything to do with planting this guy in the audience and giving me such a brilliant opening. He even recognises that I'm wearing in my lapel the flag of Free Iraq. The Kurdish people like it. Perhaps you're Kurd yourself, I don't know, but if not, even better. In England, there are, I think, only 3 villages that don't have a war memorial from the First World War. One of them is called Upper Slaughter, by the way. It's in the Cotswolds. I think there are only 3 or 4 that don't... when I was a kid, I used to notice it, and of course anyone who's been to an Anzac Day event will feel the same way. This unbelievable horror show. And culling of the young. Do you know what those villages are called by the Imperial War Graves Commission? They're called the Blessed Villages. What's blessed about being the only village in a war which was fought for God, king and country, which didn't have any casualties? And what does it make all the villages that did lose dozens, or sometimes more than that, of young men, frequently every male member of the family? Are they cursed because they did what the church and the king asked them to do? It's probably the stupidest thing the human race does, is to look for patterns in this way and say, when a baby falls out of a high-rise building and bounces on the grass below, that must be God. And when millions of children die every day for the lack of pure drinking water and just die of diarrhea in a banal manner, that's because God moves in a mysterious way or isn't involved at all. So I think we're off to a racing start, ladies and gentlemen. On the key question, anyway.
Frank Brennan, let's hear from you. Do you have any thoughts on the role of an omnipotent God in natural disasters?
Natural disasters happen, and an omnipotent God lets them happen, for those of us who believe in God. It's not about God saying that we won't let nature take its course. Those of us who do have a religious faith, we equally, I think, are committed to science, but like Christopher says, we all look for patterns. We look for patterns in our daily lives, we look for patterns in our histories, we look for patterns in the world. And yes, some villages might be called blessed. Well, if they didn't lose anyone, they wouldn't call themselves cursed. And so how do they see themselves?
Only the people who call them blessed could do that, because it's the natural corollary. Now, several leaders of the Christian church, as you know, said about the last tsunami that it was a punishment. In Britain, several of them said it was a punishment for homosexuality. That it used to be said that earthquakes were a punishment for sodomy. Since we're doing sodomy in the lash, I thought I might as well bring this up. Oddly enough, the San Francisco earthquake only hit when San Francisco was famous for other things. When New Orleans got flooded, the only bits that didn't get flooded were the red light district. Okay? So anyone who says they know God's mind in this had better not mind looking a bit foolish. Or, which you obviously don't, or had better say, take responsibility and say, yes, by letting it happen, God must in some way wish it to.
Let me bring Waleed...
Why would you do that?
Let me bring Waleed Ali into the discussion here. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, well,
and does Islam have a concept of a God that allows disasters to happen?
Well, I think by definition, if you believe in God, you would have to say that at the very least God allows this thing to happen, because to say otherwise would be to presuppose that God lacks the power to stop it, which I don't know of any religious tradition, certainly no monotheistic religious tradition that would say that. I do want to say something that I definitely agree with in what Christopher said, and that is that this sort of very simple dichotomised thinking about natural disasters, that they are punishment or reward, and this is the prism through which we view them. I mean, this has to be some of the most rudimentary, unsophisticated thinking that religious people and, frankly, irreligious people who perpetuate it even via criticism have ever produced. I think it's a ridiculous assertion. And I've not really encountered a serious religious thinker, as opposed to one who is too busy playing forms of identity politics or some other kind of rabble-rousing, persecuting some rabble-rousing religiosity, who would argue that. The simple fact is that things happen in life that are, in our subjective experiences, grotesque, and other things that are wonderful. And our judgments immediately about whether they're grotesque and wonderful are, in a sense, beside the point. The question, I think, for religious people who are actually serious about being religious people, and with all the introspection that that implies, is what do you do about it and what do you do with it? It's possible that by surviving the earthquake and moving on to behave in all sorts of ways that you cast yourself into some kind of eternal destruction in religious terms. That's entirely possible, in which case you probably would have been better off to have been killed in the earthquake. It's entirely possible that by gathering all sorts of riches in life and having an easy life, that you are similarly just deforming your character as a person. So I think the key question is not so much what is God doing, although that's a perfectly legitimate question, field of inquiry. But I think the more important question for people, particularly religious people, is who am I in response to this? What am I doing? Each of these is a test, whether you're on the good side or the bad side of it, and what do you do with it? And I'm more interested in that, frankly.
Let's hear from Anne Henderson.
Well,
Conclusive answer. What if it's random? Then why be interested?
Right over here. Aaron.
Yeah, I'm invited to be unpleasant at the expense of Ayn Rand. and objectivism. Well, that's easy. Well, the novels, first. I mean, as I keep trying to say that, you know, in my view, there's more morality in a novel by George Eliot than there is in any of the four Gospels, or the four of them put together. I care very much about literature as the place where the real dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, are met and dealt with. So to have novels as transcendently awful as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead sort of undermines my project. And then, though I have some respect for the virtue of Selfishness, a collection of essays, and I've argued about them with the chairman of the Federal Reserve, as a matter of fact. By the way, a state Federal Reserve Bank is not part of the libertarian program. Though Mr. Greenspan seems a bit iffy about this self-evident proposition. I don't think there's any need to have essays advocating selfishness among human beings. I don't know what your impression has been, but some things require no further reinforcement. Reminds me of Lillian Hellman was once in her declining years talking at some campus, and she would peer out over the crowd with her very thick dark glasses, and there was a squawking question from somewhere in the back, said, "Miss Hellman, why haven't you endorsed gay rights?" And Lillian Hellman sort of blearily peered again through and drew herself up and said, "Well, I wonder what word I'm allowed to use in this august company." I'll quote her directly then. She said, "The forms of fucking do not require my endorsement." I wasn't that much of a fan of Miss Hellman. She could be a real bitch, but I thought that said it more or less all. So to have a book strenuously recommending that people be more self-centered seems to me, as the Anglican Church used to say in its critique of Catholicism, a work of supererogation. It's too strenuous.
Let's open it up to others, and let's start with Jim Peters.
Desire to have the freedom not just of religion, but from religion, is enshrined in the founding documents of this country in a way that should make you very proud. And it should therefore put you very much on your guard that there are people who don't seem content with it, who seem always to wish to impose their own religious belief on this. To say, if only we could ban alcohol, as in the 20s, we'd have a more pure and perfect union. If only we could forbid the teaching of evolution, or get equal time for pseudoscience, like the alchemy class that follows the chemistry period in presumably these schools, or the astrology class that comes after the astronomy studies moment. Everything will be fine. Resist this with every fiber of your being. Join me, in fact, in my new favorite slogan. Mr. Jefferson, build up that wall. If someone tells me that I've hurt their feelings, I say, well, I'm still waiting to hear what your point is.
Right.
I'm very depressed how in this country you can be told, that's offensive, as if those two words constitute an argument or a comment. Not to me, they don't. And I'm not running for anything, so I don't have to pretend to like people when I don't.
Right.
You see, well, somebody laughs. You may think that those aeroplanes in this city on 9/11 came out of a clear blue sky. I believe they emerged out of a swamp of hatred created by us. I believe Please. I believe these Al-Qaeda chaps, these killers and sadists and nihilists and producers of indiscriminate explosions, wouldn't be this way if we weren't so mean to them. Now, it's true some of them, Mr. Zarqawi, their leader, of course, the bin Ladenist leader, was in Iraq before, and was well known to have been in Iraq under the rule of Saddam Hussein, and I can tell you that no one gets in and out of Iraq at that level without the President knowing. And it's also true that a group affiliated with him, the Ansar al-Islam, a fundamentalist group, thought that its main job was to kill the Kurdish leadership in northern Iraq, the elected leadership, which is a strange target, I think, for a holy war. And it's also true that some of them came to Iraq after we threw them out of Afghanistan. Well, that's easy then. Leave them in control of Afghanistan. Don't mess around with these people. Don't make them angry. Don't make them mean. It's your fault. Now, this is masochism, but it's being offered to you by sadists. Okay. I suppose we have to congratulate you on being absolutely 100% consistent in your support for unmentionable thugs and criminals. And I should thank him, by the way, for eliciting, or allowing me to elicit, or you, perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, to elicit from him what I feared, but didn't hope, but in other words, a full declaration of support for the campaign of sabotage and murder and beheading that has taken the lives of brave journalists, that demolished the offices of the United Nations, demolished the offices of the United Nations and the Red Cross. Are there any depths to which you will not sink? Shot down senior clerics outside their places of worship, and continues as a campaign of mayhem to this day. Are there no depths to which you will not sink? Mr. Galloway may have enough in his memory as a socialist, the name that he's begun to disgrace so gravely, so horribly. There seems to be a dread underlying all of this, a dread about the genitalia, a horror of women, a horror of their monthly effusions, a disgust, as I say, for their vaginas, that I don't find healthy. But it seems to me, in two senses, man-made. One, mammal-made, and two, made so that men can subordinate women, which seems to be a consistent finding in all religions. You will know that the pious Jew has to begin every day saying, God is to be thanked for not making me a woman or a Gentile. That's not moral preaching. No one goes around talking nonsense like that unless they think they have divine permission for it. Religion is therefore, yes, a poison. I mean, the president, for example,
thinks that to say someone is a person of faith is axiomatically to confer a compliment on them. And if you remember, he did it to Vladimir Putin, KGB goon and hood, and increasingly, evidently, very dangerous man to have in charge of Russia. The president meets him and says right away, well, I could tell by looking into his eyes and seeing he was wearing his grandmother's crucifix that he was just the chap for me. Now, in a strong field, I think that's the stupidest thing the president has yet said. And he must, I think, occasionally regret it. And I tried to get a researcher onto this once to find out, I just need to know something. Has Vladimir Putin ever worn his grandmother's crucifix since? Had he ever been seen wearing it before? Or did he just think this should be enough for the President of the United States? Because if so, it would show that religion was not just metaphysically incorrect, but as I have believe said, a danger and a poison to all of us. If our republic can be, and its president can be pushed over like that, like someone offering garlic to a vampire, then we really are in trouble.
Don't say, look, do yourself and your faith the honor of saying it's faith. Don't say it's science-based.
The argument
you
would
won't
be,
get away with it.
Look, the argument would be, Christopher, is that if the universe exploded into being out of nothing, then miracles are possible because the greatest miracle of all has already occurred. The question is, have miracles occurred in the first century? That requires another debate whereby we have to look at the historical evidence and see. And if it is true that that Jesus really did come and say and do the things that the New Testament writer said he did, then whatever he teaches is true, because if he rose from the dead, he was God. If he taught that there will be an intervention, then there will be. That's the argument. I don't have time to support it.
Very good. Now, a sentence or two from David Hume on miracles would clear all this up.
You'll need to.
Okay.
What have I done? It's fallen off. Sorry.
That's one up. A sentence or two from David Hume would correct what you said. A miracle is defined not as a part of the natural order, but as a suspension of the natural order.
No, an intervention.
You can't say of the Big Bang, which is the foundation of the natural order, that it's a suspension of what it starts. You may not do that. However, if you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake? And in each case you must, and especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did. I would go further and say the following. I'll grant you that it would be possible to track the pregnancy of the woman Mary, who's mentioned about 3 times in the Bible, and to show that there was no male intervention in her life at all, but yet she delivered herself of a healthy baby boy. I can say, I don't say that's impossible. Parthenogenesis is not completely unthinkable, but it does not prove that his paternity is divine. And it wouldn't prove that any of his moral teachings were thereby correct. Nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true, especially given the commonplace nature of resurrection at that time and place. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened, and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles, and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
I agree with everything Walid said. If what the question was meant to ask was, as meaning a society without religion, then I'd say you want to be careful what you wish for. And
perhaps he's talking about a society without politicians who are expressly religious.
Well,
and
then maybe we
therefore-
should all be praying very hard for that. I'm not sure. But, you know, I mean, you imagine...
Or voting very hard for it.
That's right. I mean, what Waleed said is absolutely true. Secularism means everybody can get involved, and it's a great thing about a country like this. But, you know, you imagine back in time. I don't want to imagine a world that never had Mozart or Bach in it, you know. You have to be careful what you ask
You're
for.
not religious, though. Why do you value religion?
Because I think that I'm interested in what drives human beings, in what makes human beings human. And I think there is obviously, whether you're religious or not, there is something in human beings that passions and faith override reason. In just about everything we do, from we get up in the morning and we choose what to wear, or, you know, there's a lot that's going on in human behaviour that is not that well thought out, and in fact a lot of our reason is in analysis. It's after the fact, and I think that...
None the worse for that, though.
No, well, you need both, you know.
Though it's true there aren't many secular Gothic cathedrals, for example. Verdi could write a beautiful...
What do you call the Kremlin?
No, it's Verdi could write a very good requiem without actually being a believer, but I don't think that John Donne could have written his sacred poetry not thinking, I don't really believe any of this. I mean, it's quite clear that there's an instinct in all of us for the numinous and the transcendent, you might say. I think you can have it without the supernatural. In fact, I think you have to. Well, again, I couldn't agree more with, if I may call you one in.
Well,
that's what secular means. But in that case, I think it behooves the religious to say what they genuinely mean. Now, Frank just talked about homosexuality as if the Church had never condemned it as a mortal sin.
Yes. Yes.
I mean,
yes.
It's extraordinary. I would not know that you were a member of the Society of Jesus, except that it was a very Jesuitical point you were making. and concealed you made one. And I'm sorry, Waleed, it's the same. Islam says the same. You cannot be a good Muslim and publicly be a homosexual. Why don't you, given the wonderful freedom of a secular conversation, where no one's going to say anything about your right to say it, why don't you say what you actually think? How about that?
OK, yes, Anne, and then I'd like to hear from Frank.
Can I just say that what I find interesting about your book, Christopher, is that everyone's the same, and yet we're all violently different. And if you are a cultural Catholic, as I am, I don't listen to what the Pope says every day and take my guide from him. My mother, who's 84, says she had a Vatican bypass 30 years ago. You know, it isn't like you see. Maybe because you're not a believer, you don't understand that
Sounds like progress of a kind.
No, but she converted from a completely non-believing family when she was about 20. But the thing is that religion is so manifestly pluralist as well. I mean, there's so many different ways in which people see God. And even within the Catholic Church, there's violently different ways in which people practice their faith.
Did you say
and
violently?
The idea... I missed that.
You did say violently.
Well, violently...
I
agree with you. I agree with you on all that you say about violence among religion. And that's the point. I like the old Greeks and the Romans. You had a god of war and a god of peace, and, you know, you had different kind of gods. I like that. But the idea that we're all following the Pope, I think, is a bit misguided.
OK, I want to...
You're either a Roman Catholic or not. You can be tons of kinds of Catholics.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
There are 5 popes I know about. There's a Coptic pope, there's an Eastern pope...
No, all right. Well, I'm talking about the one in Rome.
Not accepting the authority of the Holy Father, I leave it to this father. But, I mean, I think that's not...
I think since about
people
1969...
People who take their faith a la carte and cafeteria style don't impress me very much on the points of principle and conviction that we're supposed to be talking about.
If Catholics were following the Pope, they'd all have 10 children. They don't.
Well,
Frank Brennan,
that's a start too.
Can I hear Frank Brennan on the
progress of a kind?
The fundamental point that Christopher Hitchens made, which is how can you say something which is clearly against the teachings of your church, clearly against the teachings of the Pope?
I haven't said anything clearly against teaching my church or against my Pope. I have drawn a distinction.
So, but hang on a sec. Is homosexuality a sin or otherwise? And if it is a sin, is it the sort of sin that would see you go to hell according to Roman Catholicism?
No, homosexuality is not a sin. It's a disposition. If you want to argue, about whether particular homosexual acts are appropriate for an individual in a moral context, that would require a pastoral discussion with that individual. What we were discussing previously was what should be the law in a civil society such as Australia, where you have people of different religious convictions. And the question was whether or not there should be same-sex marriage. Now, that is not an issue which is resolved by determining what the Catholic Church says to its own members it regards as moral or immoral. They're quite distinct questions.
Walid Ali, you're on the same question, if you like. Is homosexuality a sin in Islam?
I'll get to that. The thing I want to say... No, but there's an important distinction here, and I get often frustrated with this discourse of lumping the Islamic tradition in with the Christian tradition, particularly the Catholic tradition, because they're structurally so fundamentally different. The Catholic tradition has a church which has a kind of divine imprimatur and authority. The Islamic tradition is a far more anarchic tradition in a sense. There is no centralised authority, especially in the Sunni tradition. So to say the Islamic teaching on anything is X is a position that immediately becomes contestable. You can try to verify it statistically or otherwise, but the point is that at the very least in theory, if not in practice, any position that you take is a position that you take that may or may not, that may be fallible and is open to being contested by other Islamic theologians or other Muslims and so on. So on any question, whether it be homosexuality or it be anything, you will find a position that the majority take. And on the question of homosexuality, undoubtedly, if you took a poll in the Muslim world, you would find that most people would consider it sinful behaviour. But if you took...
Dodging it. It's not what Muslims think, it's what Islam teaches.
Yeah, but, okay, but my question is, what exactly is your repository of a list of Islamic conclusions? There is no book called Islamic law. There is no Islamic body that says this is what Islam teaches. It has for 1400 years been an ongoing conversation. So, and what
ongoing conversations are very good.
Yeah, but that's my point. If there is a criticism I would make of the Muslim world, it is this. It is that, particularly in the post-colonial era, as religion has become an identity movement rather than something that's actually anything to do with spirituality and faith, in my view, particularly in the post-colonial world, that religiosity, Islam has become instrumentalised as a list of conclusions, as a political ideology, as though there is some manifesto you can just download from a computer and install into a society. It doesn't work that way, certainly not in the classical tradition. The classical tradition was one of constant debate. That's why it was very difficult to get something like an Inquisition going. We managed it at some point, but it was not terribly successful and it ultimately crumbled because you can't ultimately centralise authority to make definitive statements on behalf of God in the Islamic tradition. That's an act of polytheism to do that in the Islamic tradition.
I mean, North Korea is a hermetic place, unfortunately, in that it has ocean on either side of it, the demilitarized zone, which is several miles wide on the south, and Russia and China on the north. So you have a place where you can horribly conduct an experiment on human beings, essentially. You can isolate them totally. The North Korean state was set up in the same year that Orwell published 1984. And you almost think that somebody gave Kim Il-sung a copy of 1984 in Korean and said, do you think we could make this fly? And he said, well, I can't be sure, but we sure can give it the old college try. Because that's how it feels there. I went there, I thought, I've had this experience, I'll just digress for a second. I've had this experience twice in my life. Journalists hate cliché. I know it doesn't always seem like that when you read the papers, but we try and avoid them. I went to Prague once under the old days of the communist regime. I thought, whatever happens to me here, I'm not going to mention Franz Kafka in my essay. I'm going to be the first journalist not to do it. I went to a meeting of the opposition underground. Somebody betrayed us. Because the secret police came in suddenly, wham, like this, broke down the door, dogs, torches, rubber truncheons, the lot, slammed me against the wall. You're under arrest. I demand to see the British ambassador, blah, blah. You're under arrest. What's the charge? We don't have to tell you that. I thought, fuck, I've got to mention Kafka after all. They make you do it. Well, that's actually what a cliche is. Communism is a cliche in itself. Same in North Korea. I thought, I don't want to mention Orwell, I don't want to mention Orwell, now I have to mention him. There's no other standard of comparison. No, what I meant about the fear of freedom was this. Many, many people don't, of course, want to live under a hellish starvation regime of gulag type, like that. But they quite like being told what to do, and they don't want to be told that world doesn't owe them a living, and that they're on their own, and they quite like it, and repeatedly vote for parties and sometimes leaders who promise to provide everything, as long as they'll give up just a little bit of freedom. Just a little bit. And the trade-off, you'll get more security, more welfare. It's a temptation. In some cases it takes an extreme form. And I'm very impressed by how often when I debate with religious people, they will tell me that they gravitate towards faith because they want someone to, if you like, look after them. The whole idea of a heavenly Father, for example, is built up in this. There's the old joke says, some say God is dead, some say God is dad. You figure. Then there are people who, well, Islam, for example, the word Islam means surrender, prostration. You give everything to God. Everything's in His hands. This is implicitly totalitarian. That's all I mean. But I think it's innate in most people, is the feeling that they'd quite like someone to take care of them all the time. So it can be hard to argue with them that there is no such person. I invite you to the thought experiment. If it could be shown to you that the figure of the Nazarene was, in fact, as we believe, entirely mythical, as was the figure of his mother, as was the figure of Vishnu, as was the revelation supposedly given to the illiterate Arabian merchant, peasant Muhammad, the man calling himself the prophet, as was the existence of Moses and the legend of the Exodus. If all of this can be shown as it can be, I haven't time for it, but I'll take any challenge on any of these points, to be an entirely man-made legend, would you really look at your neighbor differently? Are you telling me, or are you willing to be told, even by someone as fluent and charming as Dinesh, that it would be true of yourself, that you would then become a thief, that you would then become a liar, that you would then not condemn a rapist, that you would then have no knowledge of the difference between a right action and a wicked one? I don't think there's anyone in this room who could be so abject, so wanting in self-respect, so masochistic, so subject, and I'm coming back to this, so servile, as to believe any such thing. And if I had to stop now, that's all I would really have wanted to say this evening. But as I say, I didn't come to be compassionate. I have some more suffering to inflict on you before I'm done. Ask yourself if you really wish it was true that there was a celestial dictatorship that watched over you from the moment you were born, actually the moment you were conceived, all through life, night and day, knew your thoughts, waking and sleeping. Could in fact convict you of thought crime. The absolute definition of a dictatorship can convict you for what you think, or what you privately want, what you're talking about to yourself, that monitors you like this, under permanent surveillance, control, and supervision, and doesn't even let go of you when you're dead, because that's when the real fun begins. Now, my question is this. Who wishes that that were true? Who wants to lead the life of a serf in a celestial North Korea? I've been to North Korea. I'm one of the very few writers who has. I'm indeed the only writer who's been to all three axis of evil countries, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And I can tell you, North Korea is the most religious state I've ever been to. I used to wonder when I was a kid, what would it be like praising God and thanking Him all day and all night? Well, now I know. Because North Korea is a completely worshipful state. It's set up only to do that, for adoration. And it's only one short of a trinity. They have a father and a son, as you know, the dear leader and the great leader. The father is still the president of the country. He's been dead for 15 years. But the Kim Jong-il, the little one, is only the head of the party and the army. His father is still the president, head of the state. So you have in North Korea what you might call a necrocracy. Or what I called a mausolocracy, as a thanatocracy. Just one short of a trinity. Father, Son, maybe no Holy Ghost, but they do say that when the birth of the younger one took place, the birds of Korea sang in Korean to mark the occasion. This I've checked. It did not happen. Take my word for it. Didn't occur. And I suppose I should add that they don't threaten to follow you after you're dead. You can leave North Korea. You can get out of their hell and their paradise by dying. Out of the Christian and Muslim one, you cannot. Now, this is the wish to be a slave. And in my view, it poisons human relations. All right, then. For 100,000 years, Homo sapiens has been on the planet. A fragment of evolutionary time. During that time, people were born, usually dying in the process, or at least a 10 to 20% chance of doing so. If they survive infancy, the odds go up there a lot. They probably have a life expectancy for the first 50, 60, 70,000 years of about 25 to 30 years, usually dying of their teeth. The rending pains of childbirth killing the mothers as well, famine, disease, fear, terror, earthquakes, where do they come from? Thunderstorms, why? Hurricanes, what is this? For the first 98,000 years of it, heaven watches with indifference. Who cares? Doesn't look terrific, but, you know, they're inching along, I guess. I mean, sometimes moving forward, sometimes a bit back, but no, anyway, let's just see how it goes. 2,000 years ago, it's decided, actually, now we have to intervene. But only in illiterate parts of the Middle East, to reveal our face to this species and tell them how to behave. That should do it. Now, I can't prove that that did not happen. I cannot disprove that, but I can say of someone who does believe it, that they're willing to believe pretty much anything. And I don't just mean believe pretty much anything that they're told. I mean to believe almost anything about their deity.
Well, where I come from, I can't take too much of the God is a person or a thing or a human creation. I mean, the idea of religion is a human creation, and I grew up a Catholic and we had heaps of that little pictures of what God was. But God is meaning beyond meaning, and the reason so many human beings have kept on believing in a God is because so much of ordinary material existence here doesn't explain things enough. And whether God had anything to do with natural disasters, I'm really not very interested. It's a question of when people can't understand something, they give a force, a place in their understanding, which is usually something spiritual beyond the material. And to me, what God is not so important, but what God, that idea of God, leads people to do. When the New Orleans tragedy happens, one of the most heroic acts was the way the Salvation Army was there on the spot the minute it happened. I spent 3.5 years going to Villawood Detention Centre and got very much involved, as Frank did, with the so-called illegal people that came to Australia without visas and trying to get them visas. When I went to the Yard, which was a very unpleasant place to be in every week, it wasn't the Fabian Society or the Pacifist Society that was there helping people, but invariably it was older nuns, people who had some connection with the Anglican Church. We sat down, people who believed in Islam, people who believed in Christ, people who believed in anything you could think of, and we were all kind of in the same boat together. But it was interesting how it was those that had some faith, who had the time too, no doubt, who were there helping. And to me it's...
Was this a private institution?
Well, private what institution?
The one you were visiting, was it?
I was visiting a detention centre run by the government. People who came to us, or still, it was a policy brought in by the Labor government and continued under the Liberal government and continues to this day. Now we take people to Christmas Island, which is off
I'm
the
going
coast.
to interrupt you and for a moment, and sorry to interrupt everyone just for a moment, because we actually have a question that's coming up that actually leads us in similar directions. But you're watching a special politician-free edition of Q&A, answering the big philosophical questions. The clock is ticking. Let's move to our very next question. It comes from Joel Brown.
My question is to Mr. Hitchens again. How do you account for the good work, specifically regarding the title of your book, Religion Poisoning Everything, the good work done by religious aid organisations overseas in third world and developing countries, as well as locally on our own shores and I'm sure in your country with the homeless and the needy?
Actually, Christopher, can I interrupt? Before you answer that, think about your answer for a moment, because we haven't heard from Sally Warhaft. I'd like to bring her in and then go to you.
I think this gets into the whole question of the whole argument about whether or not, you know, God is great or not great, and Christopher's argument, obviously, in his book, to me, what's missing, and I think what Waleed touched on, is that lived experience of people is much more varied and great and personal than the kind of things that you can pick out to make a case against God, or that you know, God is somehow missing from a great disaster or tragedy, but he's there in a miracle. And I just think that you know, the lived experience of people who are religious it's part of what it is to be human, it seems to be, for a great many people across time, and I don't think it's something that's going to go away.
Christopher.
This is why, towards the tail of the last question, I asked the lady from the Sydney Institute whether these institutions you're talking about...
I'm Anne.
Well, I don't know you well enough yet.
I'll just introduce myself.
Perhaps we'll be more bonded by the end of the...
Some would say not much of a lady.
We'll be more intimate by the end of the...
None of us would say that.
Well, I know people who would.
It's just not the way I was brought up. Perhaps by the end of the show we'll be more intimate. Well, I asked her about... Because she wasn't content just to say religious people volunteer for charity, as if that was news to anybody. But she had to couple it with a smear against Fabianism and social democracy. Now, as a matter of fact...
Well, they weren't there, Christopher. That's all I was saying.
I'm so sorry to say that without
the
efforts of Fabianism...
But you're good at smears.
The efforts of Fabianism...
What's wrong with the smear?
I don't... I'll get to the end of this sentence if it kills you. The efforts of socialists and social democrats to make sure that things like education and health do not depend upon private charity given by rich people and religious institutions to the deserving poor are the reasons why a lot of it's taken care of, because it's taken care of.
Hang on, I wasn't
we have welfare and...
But just a minute, there's another smear. I wasn't a rich person giving charity where it wasn't gone. And you have to understand
I didn't say that you were.
Well, it seemed to come across that way.
I didn't even imply that you were. No, the efforts of Fabianism and social democracy, socialism, were to make sure that these things didn't depend on the voluntary whim.
Yeah, but they don't do that now.
Or the idea of the deserving poor. Now, that's the first point.
I know about
the second point, well, because it's so taken for granted now, I love to remind people, actually, this meant social political action, as you correctly say, as you quite correctly say, and I can help you out here by emphasising it, quite a while ago. That's why I said not to forget it. Now, to the point about religious activism, isn't it true, haven't you all heard, that Hamas does so well because it supplies social services? Are you going to say that it's the same is true for Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Never mind that they're religious, they distribute services where otherwise there'd only be secularism and corruption. Well, if you want to claim that, you can't just claim the charitable part of it, it seems to me. Mother Teresa, endlessly praised for work that most of the time she actually never did. I went to watch her very closely in Calcutta. You don't mind that she thinks that what Bengal and Calcutta mainly needs is a campaign, a clerical campaign, against birth control and family planning. Has anyone here ever been to Bengal and concluded that's what it really needs? That's what she was really campaigning for, in case you're worried. But never mind. She gives a wonderful impression of being a charitable person. So what Indians need is more missionaries to cure poverty, when everybody knows there's only one cure for poverty, which is the empowerment of women, which means giving them some control over their reproduction. You name me a Catholic or Muslim charity that goes into the fields determined to secure the empowerment of women.
Well,
and you'll have the ghost of a point.
Let's see if Frank Brennan...
Until now you don't.
Let's see if Frank Brennan can address that point.
Well, let's take it. I mean, people like Amartya Sen have argued very strongly and persuasively, like yourself, Christopher, that empowerment of women is the key to the development of peoples. Now, why don't we just drop the bagging and smearing and saying, all right, anyone who's out there, let's judge them by their fruits. Whether they're atheists or whether they're Catholics or whatever, let's drop the bagging and smearing. Let's say, right, we agree. What we've got to be working for is the empowerment of women. And there are people of religious dispositions who are passionately committed to that. And yes, there will be mistakes made in terms of policies and in terms of moral theories, but that's where I think in a pluralist society like Australia, we can have the respectful dialogue and we can work those things through, as we do this evening.
Waleed Ali.
Just trying to figure out which aspect to take. I think...
I guess that the argument being made in that question is religion doesn't poison everything because there are people who do good works.
I think there's a real call that needs to be made for some honesty here on the part of religious people. and that is that, yes, lots of religious people do lots of very good things. And there was research published, I think, 2 years ago looking at Generation Y Australians that found that those who were more religiously committed were more socially aware, they were more committed to the social good and all that sort of thing. And you can point to those studies and you can say that's wonderful. But in a sense, I think you get caught in a reactionary argument, which is with all these people lining up saying, look how horrible religion is, you get a religious response that says, no, we're good, look at these charities, turning a blind eye to not only some of the points that Christopher raises, but also the fact that there are religious charities that do a lot of that religious work for their own ends that, in my judgment, are actually quite nefarious at times. Religions can be used as a cover and a pretext for violence and evil and all sorts of things. It can be instrumentalised in that way. It can also be instrumentalised in the opposite way. And so I kind of echo what Father Frank Brennan's said here, and that is that if you actually look to the substance of what people are doing, rather than asking the first question, is this a religious organisation or is this not, and then trying to make some judgment about their conduct and their motives on the basis of that, then I think you get further down the track of making some kind of assessment. I think we're caught in these petty games about, well, you know, are religious people good or bad? Just get on with being good or being bad and let people make up their own mind.
That's excellent. My views are, if I say it for myself, tolerably well advertised. And if they're not, it's partly your fault. Because what I say is fairly intelligible, very plainly stated. You know what I think, if you care to find out. When I debate with Jews and Muslims and Christians, I very often find, I say, well, do you really believe there was a virgin birth? Do you really believe in a Genesis creation? Do you really believe in bodily resurrection? And I get a sort of Monty Python reply. Well, this is all a bit metaphorical, really. You hear it very often said by people of a vague faith, that, well, it may not be the case that religion is metaphysically true. Its figures and its stories may be legendary or dwell on the edge of myth, prehistoric. Its truth claims may be laughable. But allow for all that. Allow for all that. You still have to credit religion with being the source of ethics and morals. Where would we get these from if it weren't for faith? I don't believe that it's true that religion is moral or ethical. I certainly don't believe, of course, that any of its explanations about the origin of our species or the cosmos or its ultimate destiny are true either. In fact, I think most of these have been conclusively, utterly discredited. But I'll deal with the remaining claim. Is it moral? Again, I can only do Christianity this evening. Is it moral to believe that your sins, yours and mine, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, can be forgiven by the punishment of another person? Is it ethical to believe that? Do you not in fact hear it said repeatedly about religion and by the religious themselves that, well, it may not be really true, the stories may be fairy tales, the history may be dubious, but it provides consolation? Can anyone hear themselves saying this or have it said of them without some kind of embarrassment, without the concession that thinking here is directly wishful, that yes, it would be nice if you could throw your sins and your responsibilities on someone else and have them dissolved, but it's not true and it's not morally sound. Well, I asked her about, because she wasn't content just to say religious people volunteer for charity, as if that was news to anybody, but she had to couple it with a smear against Fabianism and social democracy. Now, as a matter of fact...
Well, they weren't there, Christopher, that's all I was saying.
I'm so sorry to say that without... the efforts of Fabianism...
But you're good at smears.
The efforts of Fabianism...
What's wrong with the smear?
I don't... I'll get to the end of this sentence if it kills you. The efforts of socialists and social democrats to make sure that things like education and health do not depend upon private charity given by rich people and religious institutions to the deserving poor are the reasons why a lot of it's taken care of, because it's taken care of.
Hang on, I wasn't
we have welfare and...
But just a minute, there's another smear. I wasn't a rich person giving charity where it wasn't gone. You have to understand
I didn't say that you were.
Well, it seemed to come across that way.
I didn't even imply that you were. No, the efforts of Fabianism and social democracy, socialism, were to make sure that these things didn't depend on the voluntary whim.
Yeah, but they don't do that now.
Or the idea of the deserving poor. Now, that's the first point.
I know about
the second point, well, because it's so taken for granted now, I love to remind people, actually, this
was a long time
ago. Meant social political action, as you correctly say, as you quite correctly say, and I can help you out here by emphasising it, quite a while ago. That's why I said not to forget it. Now, to the point about religious activism, isn't it true, haven't you all heard, that Hamas does so well because it supplies social services? Are you going to say that it's the same is true for Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Never mind that they're religious, they distribute services where otherwise there'd only be secularism and corruption. Well, if you want to claim that, you can't just claim the charitable part of it, it seems to me. Mother Teresa, endlessly praised for work that most of the time she actually never did. I went to watch her very closely in Calcutta. You don't mind that she thinks that what Bengal and Calcutta mainly need